This is Natasha Helfer, and I wanted to just give you a few updates that are happening at Symmetry Counseling and in my practice in the coming months. I will be holding my first Ketamine group session on January 25th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. in our Holiday, Utah office, with the theme being Reclaiming Female Sexuality. There's 15 spots available, so I know that they'll go quickly, so make sure you call to register. We are super excited to be using ketamine at Symmetry. It's an extremely helpful medicine in helping people with stuck thinking patterns. So this is where so many people benefit from, either past trauma or past education, past sex negative messaging, lots of things that you can feel stuck on and you want to kind of redirect and re-explore your body, your preferences, your identity, your joy, your pleasure, right? And we want to get old thinking unstuck. So super excited to be offering this. It will be kind of a uniquely guided experience. I'm going to curate for you to feel safe and to be able to explore a lot of these themes that we're going to be talking about. If you are a current client of mine or past client of mine, I'm offering an additional 10% off the early bird or regular price, depending on when you sign up. You have until December 15th to still benefit from the early bird rate. Yeah, just call the office for information and you will be able to get registered for that. Other groups, I'm starting in January. So my pretty popular Navigating Ethical Non-Monogamy group is going to be starting on January 17th on Fridays from noon to 1:30 Mountain Time. You can join these anywhere in the world as long as it works with your time difference changes. And it will be 7 weeks long, and it is for either couples or individuals who are interested in potentially starting non-monogamy in their lives, or maybe have already been in the lifestyle but are wanting to either get better at certain aspects of it, learn how to deal with challenges in more effective ways. I will also be doing a Healing from Male Sexual Shame group starting on January 30th. This will be on Thursdays from noon to 1:30, again, Mountain Time, again, online. So you can join me from anywhere. And this group is kind of for people who identify as male and either come from purity culture, sex negative thinking, and potentially also were treated under the sex addiction narrative and ways that has hurt them from considering themselves just on the spectrum of human diversity versus diseased or sick or something along those lines. So that's also a very popular group, and I encourage you to sign up for that if you haven't. I also have one of my providers, Sarah Rands. She's going to be offering a group on dating and kind of the typical challenges of dating as an adult. It's meant for any gender, any sexual orientation, and that will be a 6-week also online group. So if you're interested in that as well, call the office at Symmetry Counseling. And I also want to let people know that we have 2 current interns at our practice who are taking on new clients, as well as some of our more established providers. So we do have openings at Symmetry Counseling. I know sometimes people have a hard time finding a therapist with openings. And we work with all the general things as well, of course, the specific intersection and expertise on religion, mental health, and sexuality. So that's a little bit about us, and hope you're having a great day. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel or also offering a donation to keep this podcast alive. And thank you so much for listening.
Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame anywhere we can get to it. So whether that's religiously, sexually, relationally, all the many ways shame shows up in our lives. So super excited to have Mike Fuller here with us today. But before we get started, I just want to give a few announcements. Wanted to let people know about several groups that we're starting at Symmetry Counseling starting in January. One will be a ethical non-monogamy group, which is either for couples or individuals who are either interested in the lifestyle or are already living the lifestyle and want to know healthy principles for moving forward in that space more effectively and relationally sound. And we also have a male sexual shame group that's starting mostly for people who identify as men and grew up in purity culture, maybe oftentimes were shamed or told they were sex or porn addicts, or even maybe went to treatment centers that took those kinds of approaches and realize now maybe post faith transitions that was actually more harmful than helpful. So we talk about how to get into healthy sexual spaces as grown adult men. We also have a dating group that is going to be run by two of my providers, Sarah Rands and Darby Mest. And they're going to be addressing the many challenges that people find in adult dating and also teach healthy principles there and have, some ideas about how to deal with those challenges. And I'm also running a ketamine group, which will be a one-day event. And that's going to be for people who identify as women and who want to focus on the topic of reclaiming their female sexuality. So all of that can be found at our website, simcounseling.com. If you want more information, you can definitely call the office and figure out how to register. So that's some announcements from our end. But more than anything, I want to take this opportunity to introduce my guest tonight. And this is Mike Fuller. He has a master's in social work, is currently working towards his license. He taught seminary full-time for 20 years. And for those of you who maybe don't come from LDS background, what that means in our culture, in Mormon culture, it's not exactly what it means in other cultures as far as theology training. So maybe you can explain a little bit about that. But basically, seminary is a program for youth, for adolescent youth, teenage, high school type age. And in 2020, when his wife, Carrie, said she was done with the church, he quit his career a year later and went back to school to become an Affirming licensed clinical social worker and is now in the process of becoming a certified sex therapist through ASECT. So I'm super glad when people are doing that. That's awesome. He works with adults that find themselves in intersections of faith, sexuality, gender, relationship changes. He's currently a board member for the Mormon Mental Health Association. He enjoys playing softball and eating chocolate. We have one of those things in common, Mike. Mike and his wife also enjoy kayaking, hiking, and playing pickleball. Have two sons and are former foster parents and live in Nampa, Idaho. So welcome to the program.
Thank
Mike,
you.
I'm so glad to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to kind of dive in to just, this journey, right? I mean, so many people are going on life journeys. I mean, we all do in one way or another, but this journey of kind of going from a more traditional, high demand religion, whether it's culture or family and all the things that go along with that, and then how it progresses for you to shift and change in so many different ways where you now are working with primarily LGBTQ folks, and I'm guessing have had quite a shift in your belief systems, and your ideas of how to look at the world and your worldviews. And so maybe why don't we start with kind of your beginning years? Like how did you grow up? What was your growing up experience? How did your family intersect with religion and the many things that led you to be, for example, a seminary teacher in the Mormon Church?
Yeah, growing up, I grew up in the Boise, Idaho area, which I still live around, and I'm licensed in Utah. Currently, I'll be fully licensed this summer and expand to other states. But just had, I think, a typical Mormon upbringing. I use that word because I'm not describing the church, but yeah, I did all the church things. We did most of the church things, some of the times at home. I've got a lot of siblings and served a mission. And got home from my mission, met a beautiful woman, and 6 months later we got married because that's what you did back then. And said I thought I wanted to go into education, and she said, "Why don't you try seminary?" And now we joke that it's her fault, or she jokes about that. And yeah, did the very normal Mormon life until my mid-40s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So talk us through what that means. Like, what does, becoming a seminary teacher entail? What kind of education do you get for that? What kinds of job opportunities do you have? And what are you expected to do and to believe and to be as you're, engaging in that type of work environment?
It is in the hiring process, which was very extensive, they informed us that they use analogies of glass houses, and that we as a couple were to represent the first presidency. That we both were returned missionaries, wife Carrie and I, and in the hiring process was quite extensive, and I was interviewed by some German guy at the time. I didn't know who he was. Now most of us know him as President Dorf.
Oh, wow. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. You have to get approved by a general authority of the church. And he interviewed my wife first and just said, does he treat you right? And that was his biggest emphasis. Yeah. And it was, we did we were all in, did the Mormon thing. And I got hired a year or so after we were married and had our first child. And I got actually hired the same month we had our second child, and started my teaching full time that August. And it was, I ended up teaching exactly 20 years to the month.
Wow. Okay. And for those who are listening who maybe don't know much about LDS culture, can you explain what the seminary program is?
Yeah. So in states where it's legally allowed, and at a high school where there's over 100 students, so thinking basically from Arizona through Utah and to the end of Idaho. I tell people that Utah ends at the Oregon-Idaho border, where I'm 30 miles from, right? The interstate and the southern half of Idaho. Every high school within 25 miles of I-84 in Idaho, and all the high schools in Utah, and a bunch of them in Arizona, they have a little building that the church has bought the land and purchased, and it's separate. It's separation from church and state, where the kids are allowed to. It's called release time. So if they grew up in California or anywhere else in the United States or world, high schoolers attend the seminary program for 4 years. Early morning everywhere else, but if there's enough, they have it release time. So the parents sign a document that says, I'm releasing my child. After Mass, they can go to their religious education class. We give them 5 minutes to get there after the bell rings, and 5 minutes before the bell rings, we send them back. They give them a little travel time, and they go back to their biology class in high school. So for 4 years, good Mormon kids go to seminary every day. And
they're good ones.
So I have the lifestyle of I have a master's degree in education that the church paid for after I was hired by them. And in my master's program, I remember all the teachers complaining. I just thought, man, I've got a better employer than the public educators. But yeah, I was a high school educator. That my curriculum was just different. The topic was different, and so we taught the kids about Jesus. And there's a 4-year curriculum, all the different standard works of the LDS Church, and then they'd go back to high school.
Okay, and I believe I'm saying this correctly, but it counts for high school credit, correct?
No,
even if it does not. Okay, I thought it did.
Kids give up it's an elective. They give up a credit.
Okay.
There's no sharing of information other than the name. The schools tell us which kids are attending, and that's all they share. We do it in our own grading system, but we don't share that with. So no, kids are sacrificing for the Lord to attend seminary.
Right.
Or to get up.
Yeah, so they're usually they're giving up an elective like band or art or something along those lines. It's not maybe necessary for their credits, but
no,
they're going to this class instead. Okay. So LDS kids in what we would, I guess, lovingly call the Book of Mormon belt instead of the Bible belt, like you're talking about, right? Between Arizona and Idaho, and definitely parts of California, parts of Wyoming, but definitely Utah, Idaho, and Arizona are probably the most highly populated LDS states. These kids, during their school day, go to a class in a building that is adjacent to the high school that the church has purchased that property. Kids who do not live in the Book of Mormon Belt have to figure out a time to go to seminary outside of the school day. So for a lot of people, that's early morning. And so like in Kansas where I lived, there's an early morning. So they have to go before high school. So get up even earlier than what high school kids already have to get up for and go to this seminary class that's usually taught in somebody's home or in the church building, depending on where geographically it's easier for everybody to gather. And in really remote places, some of these classes are actually only happening once a week because they can only gather once a week because they're very geographically separated. So is that fair?
Yeah, and depending on the size of the high school, in Idaho, 10 to 30% of the high school kids were attending our programs at the different schools that I was at. So I was at one of the largest high schools in Idaho, and we had over 600 seminary students. And so I typically taught over 150 kids every semester.
Okay. Yes, these are large programs. And again, in the Book of Mormon Belt, usually they have trained professionals like you to come in and teach these classes. Outside of the Book of Mormon Belt, it's usually a calling, and somebody from the local congregation just volunteers to teach the classes that don't have necessarily formal training around these topics. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep.
All right. And then these classes, so seminary is considered, in my understanding, mandatory. You have to be a seminary graduate these days to be able to apply to schools like Brigham Young University, whether it's Provo or Idaho or Hawaii. There are some exceptions, I think, for some students, depending on family situation and whether or not they're LDS, because not all people who go to those schools happen to be LDS, but the large majority are. Is that fair? Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think they might have discontinued it right near the end, but for the majority of my career, I would actually sign endorsements for students so the BYU system would send us an email saying, hey, this kid wants to go, would you answer these questions about them? And we'd have to, advocate for our kid, depending on their grades or attendance and whatnot. But yeah, it was often used by families more than I think myself. But as parents would say, hey, if you want to go to a church school, you got to go to seminary. So it was definitely part of the process, part of the system.
And I think it's confusing for people outside of our faith community because seminary usually means like theological school, right? Like people who are studying to be priests or pastors and other types of church organizations. So that is not what it means here.
No, it's just a high school religious release time course. So if a kid went to a Catholic school, for example, they might have a Bible study class during the middle of their day. The church basically, in Utah, as Utah was organized, basically the church could have tried to have done something like they recognized that instead of paying for both the public schools and having their own public school system, they chose this route where we want to literally inoculate or indoctrinate. That's some of the words that we were taught in our trainings. The youth was through this release time program.
Right. So, for example, Catholics may send their kids to Catholic school. They're going to have a mixture in those schools of course, regular classes like math, biology, English, but they're also more than likely going to have some religious classes as well. That's, included in that Catholic training.
Yeah.
It's similar to that, except for we have this side thing. Okay. Now seminary, and my one last thing, I don't want to talk all the time about seminary, but I do think interesting things. I think seminary is, in my experience, having gone to some seminary, I was not a seminary graduate. I was not one of the good ones. But I did go to some of it. Is my recollection and what I've seen in the curriculum is that it's treated kind of what I would say like a dual class. Some of it is spiritual training, I guess, like I would say spiritual ideas and how do we draw closer to the Lord and to God and those kinds of things. But I do think that a lot of it is treated like history, like a history class. And so what we are, depending on the standards of works that you're learning, whether it's the Book of Mormon or the Bible or the Doctrine and Covenants, it's treated like a history class where kids are being told things that are treated like they're historically accurate. And I think this is one of the concerns that a lot of LDS, especially post members, but even nuance members have, is that this isn't actually necessarily accurate. So can you talk about, especially as you and your wife are going through a faith transition, and I'm assuming that as you were a CES instructor yourself, that you really believed as you were teaching these things that they were historically accurate. And when and where did that start falling apart for you?
Yes, I did. It started for my wife, especially with the introduction of the gospel topic essays that came out, I believe, in 2011 to 2013. And interestingly, she read those because we were told in a training that we all should, and our wives were invited to most of our trainings, right? That we, spouses, but majority of my colleagues were male, that we should learn them like the back of our hands. And gone were the days when we could just tell a kid that, hey, I'm aware of that, but it doesn't faze me, that we need to know these details. In general, up until then, me and my colleagues were the most ignorant members of the church when it comes to the histories or the quote unquote ex-Mormon literature that now we've really found is most of it was probably accurate. We were told to teach the scriptures, teach the church's doctrine. So we mostly, as a cohort, studied the church's material and knew that like the back of our hands, and all the other information. I can count on more than one hand any colleague that really said, "Oh, I'm familiar with all this other material that and would become the expert for the rest of us." But until the gospel topics essays came out, I had no idea. I never taught definitively that Joseph Smith had plural wives because I'd never read it in a church doctrine, in an official church publication. I've since tried to find it, and I guess maybe in the late or the mid 2000s, a sentence was added to a manual. But an official church publicated document, there is, including the magazines, does not ever, until this century, admit that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, for example. So these different gospel topic essays came out. So there's 11 of them. They talk about some difficult topics, historical topics that the church faced. And I actually was given a raise to study them. They created a system. Like most teachers, we got paid by years of teaching and level of education. So I had a master's degree, and they said, "Oh, if you do an internal study within our system, we'll give you a raise." And so it was one of the projects they had me complete was to read all those and write an essay after each one. And at the end of that year, I got an $8,000 raise after that was one of the 12 projects I completed. So I did not study them critically. I studied them to get a raise. I studied them to be a better apologist. But at the meantime, my wife was studying them critically.
Right. So let's go back even maybe to some of your own training to get this job to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're saying you got a master's in education. I'm assuming that was through an accredited school, and that mm-hmm. didn't necessarily have anything to do with religion. Is that correct? That was just a regular.
That's correct. That was just, yeah. Yeah, it was just from Boise State University, just to help me become a better teacher. Yeah, we got to choose.
What actual training did you have to go through to become and be eligible to become a CES instructor?
Most of us were institute graduates, and then within that program, they have 2 classes that you take. They sort of vet you through those classes and then have you teach your own, do a 2-week, usually at the end of the school year, teaching experience, and then they let you teach part-time and hire you part-time to fill in classes. And during that part-time process, you're in the hiring process. And they had the numbers were pretty significant of how many people start saying they want to become a teacher and they get hired. The year I got hired, I think system-wide, there was typically around 1,600, I think, full-time religious educators for the church at the time. And they hired maybe 38, I think, the year I was hired. And they had a potential couple hundred or more that were in the hiring pool. So it's a sought-after job. People want to be like seminary instructors.
not many get to the end of that.
Yeah, in that worldview, I thought that would be a good way to help people improve their lives. People ask me, well, why'd you go from this to that? I said, in both worldviews, I think these are good ways to help people improve their lives.
And when you say the word institute, again, to explain, basically that's the same kind of type of program that you have in high school, but it continues in college, right?
Yeah.
So this is like a 4-year college now program that's similar to the seminary program. And again, it's not robust. It's not like going to seminary school, learning theology, having to be critical thinkers, having to, learn actual history. This is just like whatever the church wants to teach as far as the way it is, then you learn that. And then you continue to teach that, recycle all that to the new generation of students.
Yes, we weren't necessarily theologians. We were experts on LDS doctrine.
Well, current LDS doctrine that is whitewashed and supported by the current leaders of the church, right? Not necessarily what we would consider a robust history of LDS and Mormon history and kind of how doctrine has shifted along the years. Which is why you're saying, because there are people who are in the LDS community, whether they're historians or whether they're Sunstone, presenters, or that do know a lot of that. Oftentimes, many of them get in trouble throughout the years and get excommunicated for writing accurate history of the church, even if they're wanting to be in the church and want to be part of their community. But that's not how seminary teachers are taught.
No.
Okay, so let's what are you comfortable sharing about your faith transition and how this starts? Where do you start seeing red flags go up? How do you start dealing with cognitive dissonance? How do you start wondering about, wait a minute here, what am I teaching? What am I thinking?
It began with my wife, in January of 2020, so pre-COVID. She just told me finally that she was done with the church. We'd been married for 20 years and I'd been an employee for 19 years. People asked her if she was afraid to tell me, and she says her answer was no. I knew Mike wasn't an asshole, which I don't know if a spouse can give or get a better compliment. And it created a lot of awakening. And so I learned a whole new vocabulary. I learned a whole new source of information. We learned what differentiation was, and she was able to, have a clear definition of herself and be comfortable with me having my own experiences. And it was a year where we were in a mixed faith marriage, and the conversations were difficult. More than once I ended up in the fetal position in the closet because my body was not able to process this shattering of my world. She would feel bad that that's how I reacted and wanted to just, okay, then we'll quit talking about it. I said no, that maybe we'll go slower, or we stopped talking about some topics, and then. But yeah, we continued to have these conversations. I continued to teach. It was easier. COVID was difficult for everybody, but it was easy for me professionally. I could teach. I was teaching online. I was teaching for half-hour lessons. I was teaching from the Book of Mormon that year and just saying, hey kids, read these verses about Jesus and tell me what you teach. And then go into a breakout room and tell each other what you learned about your Jesus. And so I have receipts, but I think I had 30-something or 40-something therapy sessions that year, probably more than I'd had my entire life, more than doubled what I'd had my entire life previous. And I thought that summer, I made the decision with the assistance of my therapist to I'll go one more year, and then next summer I'll decide. But I didn't factor in that in January. We switched in January of 2021. When we switched curriculum, we switched to church history, and I had to start teaching about. I lasted a week in the classroom before I ended up.
Wow.
I feel I resigned. The paperwork said I was fired for breach of contract, but But that day, the day that I quit my job, Natasha, was the best day of my life. Even though it was before that, it was the scariest. I couldn't talk to a I couldn't talk to any of my supervisors at fear that I'd leave. And at the time, the first question was, can I keep my job? And can my wife be authentic and not be a believing member of this church? Because we were hired as a couple. We were supposed to present as a couple. I have colleagues that are in the system. I keep asking them, do you know anybody? And I've found out there's one seminary teacher in the state of Utah who apparently has a spouse that's fully not active in the church, and everybody knows about it. So that was my thing. I wanted to maintain my employment. I thought as I was deconstruction, I still wanted to be a good force for these kids. I wanted to be an ally for my students. I wanted to be supportive there. But the whole time was, could I keep my job? I didn't have anybody to ask. I ended up messaging John DeLynn, of all people, once I found out who he was. And I was like, and I found Symmetry. So, I mean, I've met with two of your people at Symmetry Solutions providers, right? I just have learned so much from them. They're both female. But I was like, hey, John DeLynn, do you know anybody that I can ask this question to? And so I wanted both of us to be authentic. And she was willing at the time to say, okay, I'll just be quiet so you can keep your job. And I didn't want her to have to be quiet. But then finally, I had deconstructed to where I couldn't teach with integrity. I really always honored the parental code. I called it that I was providing an educational experience for the parents of these students. And that's who I was working for. And I felt that when I couldn't teach what the curriculum was asking me to teach.
And why?
Because my values do not align with the Joseph Smith and the church that I realized when I became aware of the values that I feel that it has. They didn't align anymore.
Okay. And was there also like a factor of like inaccuracies? Like you said, when it was church history, it lasted a week. So was it just like, oh, they're teaching a different version of church history than what we've researched?
That was part of it, but it was for me, it was more values-based. It was like, hey, I can't teach my students because I felt that I was, because I personally felt that the Joseph Smith that I taught and I revered was not the historical Joseph Smith. I taught what I call the legacy Joseph Smith. You remember the movie, The Legacy?
Sure do.
I taught that, the one that told Buddy, hey, I helped my wife with the chores to an immigrant, and taught, but the Joseph Smith that I came to know, his values don't align with mine.
Are you comfortable sharing, like bullet listing a bit of that? Like, okay, here's the values I thought I was signing up for, and here's the values I started realizing were kind of historically more accurate.
Loving our neighbors, all of our neighbors as ourselves would probably fit most of it. And then, again, just the being honest to your partners and your spouses. That's not the Joseph Smith that I came to find out.
Yeah. Okay. So just in some of your language, you can start to hear like how devastating this was, right? When you're kind of position and you're, sobbing in a closet and you're having to seek more therapy than you've ever had in your whole life. And I'm guessing at first it was kind of like a mixed faith marriage type of scenario, right? And trying to make sense of, okay, why is my spouse coming to me and telling me these kinds of things? And I may or may not agree with her. And then what are we going to do if we have separate beliefs and systems, right? And then of course it's tied to your employment, and that seems very complicated when your belief system is tied to your employment.
I think everybody that experiences a faith deconstruction and removes himself with their religion of their upbringing or their choice is going to experience losses. And everyone's going to have what I call their unique big loss. And it might sound, I don't think it sounds petty, but mine was my employment, which was my livelihood. And it was a career more than it was a career that I really enjoyed, or felt I did. But I also, the day I quit my job, 6 months later, I weaned myself off of 5 different medications that I felt I was being over-medicated to live in what I now call for me, that Mormon experience. I was heavily medicated to survive it, personally.
Can you talk about that? What do you mean by that?
the day I quit my job, the physical symptoms that I would experience on a regular basis that were right here, just this anxiety, this discomfort that I wasn't doing I wasn't fully living what I was teaching, the shame you would call it, that it was just palpable. The way my wife explained it, she said, I didn't know that it wasn't normal for a partner to give their husband a massage to get him to go to work, even though I thought I was a work that I enjoyed and loved. It was interesting. I don't know.
So are you talking about symptoms, like mental health symptoms that you were dealing with when you were dealing with the contradictions of, trying to be active and trying to be employed and your beliefs not matching up? Or are you talking about
lifelong symptoms of imposter syndrome, now I'd call it, of feeling that I was just the shame that it's a shame-based system. And so, being told I was in my career, we were told we were never good enough. That was the main message we received. It's always improve, always improve.
After all you can do.
Yeah. And so for me, it was, I didn't know. I always thought, I must have a genetic mental health disorder. Because I couldn't attribute it to the system. The system that says, here's your problems, for feeling guilty for not reading a book every day. How weird is that, right? I felt guilt for not reading a book or books every day. I felt guilty because I didn't pray every day with myself, then my spouse, then my family, multiple times a day. I felt guilt for that. I felt shame for that. And so I think it was Martha Beck that said, I think what it said, your journey or hell is your expertise. So I'm just taking all the things I've learned from my experience and the training that I've received and helping other people now.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're really alluding to, specifically in high demand religion, there's so many standards, so many markers for, trying to perfect yourself and trying to, in Mormon land, we talk about getting to the celestial kingdom, but other religions, it's about getting to heaven or avoiding hell or brimstone and firestone or whatever those things are. There's so many factors that it's so unrealistic that you can actually meet all of those standards, that you're in a constant relationship with yourself of not being good enough, of not meeting the mark. And so then even people who, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think many LDS people that I have, interacted with are really amazing people, really good people doing really good things, being productive members of their society and their community and serving and going to church and raising kids and, for the most part, pretty good folks. But even those folks, there's always something that you're not doing good enough, right? Even if it's something you're just thinking, even something like sexual fantasies or, feeling lazy or not, or having doubts about.
Yeah, the shame that Mormon men feel just because they might think that another woman or their spouse is attractive is destructive.
Yeah. Okay, so you're going along your life, being the good Mormon guy, to the point that you become a teacher of Mormonism. You go through a faith crisis, which sounds like it was really, obviously disorienting. At the same time, you quit your job. You feel this relief, this actually physiological relief, it sounds like. And then what? How are you going to, now it's time to rebuild, right? We talk about deconstructing and then we talk about reconstructing, right? So how do you start making decisions about where you're going to go next and how you become interested in social work, etc.?
Yeah, one brick at a time. I realize I went from what I call a belief-based decision-making model to a values-based decision-making model. And I learned a whole new vocabulary, and I learned, what differentiation was and a partial marriage was from Julie Hanks. I learned about shame from you at the time. I became a failed solar salesman in Texas while you were getting excommunicated. For a month, came back and decided to go back to school. My wife finished her education, so it took me I waited a little bit, went back to school. Chose social work, knowing that I wanted to be a clinical social worker, and found my first internship site was I just happened upon this place called Flourish that provides affirming mental health care. It's a nonprofit, so affordable scholarships for people that are in the LGBTQIA plus community. Knowing that I came from a very naive community and from a very naive subset of that community, I thought that would be a good first internship site. I'm still there now as I get fully licensed this summer. I've started my own private practice and will continue building that. And so I just realized I help people in midlife go through life transitions. They don't have to be the same as mine, but just tools and skills to help people figure life out when the rug gets pulled out from underneath them.
Yeah, and my guess, I mean, I know the founder of Flourish, the owner of Flourish is Lisa Hansen, and I'm assuming not everybody who goes to Flourish comes from an LDS background, of course, but I'm guessing there is a lot of intersection between LDS and Mormon populations with the work that you're doing. Is that fair to?
Yeah, I would say that not only from that, but the majority of my clients have had some type of averse religious experience from various denominations. Majority of my clients, I can relate to that, are neurodivergent, and I can relate to that. And then I just share with them that I'm a straight, cisgendered white male, and I bring that's part of the process and part of the therapeutic experience that my clients have is I'll point out my privilege and point out where they might have, if a client has less privilege than me. So I just, yeah, I think I answered your question.
Yeah, well, so I'm kind of interested in, we've talked a lot about the history of the church, but at some point or another, I mean, you were teaching teenagers for a long time. Mm-hmm. Teenagers are oftentimes dealing with issues of doubt, issues of conflict with their parents. Their parents are maybe forcing them to go to seminary and they don't want to be there. Some do, obviously, a lot of them do, but some of them don't. I'm guessing you were teaching queer kids, whether you realized it or not, whether or not they were out, obviously, or not. So when did you start having not just like a historical faith crisis, but like a social justice faith crisis in regards to understanding how the church talks about like LGBTQ folks, for example, is highly problematic?
Yeah. In not just in my master's degree in social work, but had become aware of the concept of being trauma informed, and I realized that not knowing fully what that meant, I realized I was a trauma informed classroom instructor just by nature. I had a basket in the back of the room with blankets that my students could use. I had a drawer in my office where all my students knew they could go get something to eat if they didn't have something to eat. If you needed to take a nap, let me know. I just had a little protocol saying, hey, just let me know what you're doing, check in with you. I realized looking back that I was as affirming as possible in the system that I was living in. I was an affirming classroom instructor. Yes, I did have kids that were LGBTQ, and I would tell them, hey, this is a safe space for you. That's what I'm going to create. They'd tell me stories about how they might get treated at their ward, and my response would be, please let me know if that happens in my classroom, because I don't tolerate that. It just sort of came naturally, and then I don't know if I stumbled upon it, but I don't know if that's accurate, but just part of my nature, I think, to care for other people. I think most human beings do. There's just different values that lead us as we do that.
Did your master's in education offer you any kind of thought process in regards to marginalized students and students who are discriminated against, whether it's students of color or students who are queer or students who are going through traumatic experiences in their home environments, etc.?
Yeah, it was touched upon in maybe one class specifically on it, but yeah.
As an LDS person at the time, did you find conflict with that? Like, how do I do that? Or was that pretty easy for you to?
I felt like I was, I don't know how to answer that question, Tasha. I think that I have I felt like on one hand I was as affirming as possible, but also felt that, oh, these are doctrines that we're supporting. So I guess you could say I value doctrines as back then as much as any other believing member of the church. I often wonder too how long I would have stayed in church if I wasn't employed by it. It's a question I quite often wonder. How much would I'd always say to myself, am I here because I want to, or because I know my job requires it? Every once in a while that will come in my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is that many of us who are in the church and become more nuanced or more progressive or more trauma informed, even though we want to stay in the church or we still have certain beliefs, we are kind of in conflict with what the church is talking about in regards, especially like LGBTQ youth, right? And so how do you get to a point where your LGBTQ youth in your classroom are saying, hey, I'm being discriminated against in my ward, and you are able to offer a different approach than maybe what they would find?
I guess my answer is that's just me, my nature. That's obvious. That was about, I realize now, I would say that was a value of mine that I honored as much as I could in the system that I was brought up in. Mm-hmm. And now I'm able to honor that value fully. Mm-hmm. I'm able to be loving and accepting to everybody instead of just those that, instead of having that, oh, but they're not going to, oh, but they're, oh, buts, you know, they're not following, they're not going to get twos. I mean, I barely lasted a year. And even then it was so truncated because of COVID that the experience, I don't know how your eyes were opened longer and still maintained that. And that mine was just, for me, it just, even though it was a full 12 months, I have receipts. I was doubting, within a month of her telling me that. It was, yeah. I have an email I wrote an email to one retired colleague, because that's the only person on the planet I could talk to. Mm-hmm. And it was after listening to Carolyn Pearson. And I remember reading Upton Sinclair. It's difficult to convince a man something when his livelihood depends upon him not believing it, or something to that effect, right? I remember reading at the right time Maya Angelou saying, do your best, and you know better, do better. That helped me really process a lot of guilt I might have felt or had if I hadn't otherwise heard that. So, and you talk about teenagers. It was in my interview with Lisa Hansen for that internship. I said, I didn't know her at the time from Adam or Eve, but I said, I don't think I want to work with minors. Is that okay? So I only work with adults as a clinical social worker. I only see adults.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing, especially when we have that intersection between mental health and religion. I think back, all the way back to my being, 19 years old, 20 years old at BYU, starting to study psychology, my bachelor's in science and psychology, and this topic coming up, especially around LGBTQ folks. And just, on the one hand, it was like, well, of course it's a sin because that's what we believe, right? So I just had that automatic reaction. And on the other hand, I remember even at a very early age being uncomfortable, like there was something uncomfortable about it. And listening to people's justifications of how they would say it was a sin and being like, okay, kind of like these apologetics, right? And how they explain the doctrine. And I'm like, okay, so as I think of my development and my own professional journey and going into my master's degree, even still thinking very much it was a sin to be gay or to act gay, either one, and having my first gay clients, in my internship in Wichita, Kansas, and then other places, understanding I never had a problem understanding my ethical responsibility, like that I wasn't supposed to impose my personal beliefs onto other people who had different beliefs, but I still had that internal, notion and belief system. So I have to assume that was not great, that I had that as I was treating people that, were very different than I was, and had different belief systems, although some of them also had internalized, shame, and they come from their own religious backgrounds and felt what they were doing was sinful, even though they were just, for goodness grief, being gay. So it is an interesting progression for me to think, okay, I went from being like, well, even if I believe it's a sin, I need to be ethical. But then I went to this questioning, like, well, is it a sin? And why do we think it's a sin? And could there be some bias around that? And, and then doing that for several years, and then finally landing on, I don't think this is a sin. I think we've got this wrong, right? But still very much wanting to be a part of my community and still believing many other things, but not that, and so that was kind of my progression, and when I think about, towards the end, it's like, not only is it not a sin, and not only do I not believe in this, but I've got to advocate for those within my community because we're harming them, and so that was my progression. I guess that's kind of what I'm asking you, it's like, how do you, and you're saying, well, from a pretty early space, you were able to just feel like, okay, I'm going to support these people, even though my church and who I teach for and who employs me has some different teachings around this.
Yeah, it's like, how does anyone that's believing, well, they put things on shelves and they enjoy their privilege. Mm-hmm. I might have a student that feels that way, but I had the privilege, and it's not wasn't it, a personal experience or a personal experience of people really close to me. So I was able to just, I can be loving to this person and then go home. So it's an interesting experience to see how people, I guess it was just a lifetime of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's so interesting. And I guess I'm just inviting everybody who's listening to be thinking about, okay, that was Mike's journey. That was Natasha's journey. What's my journey? Where am I at on this? Where do I land on this kind of journey of being taught a certain thing? And then maybe landing in a place where I either still believe those things that I was taught, or I've completely shifted, So that's just an interesting thing for all of us to be thinking about.
There was a time I did have a tie tack, and I think I might have it even behind me. It was a pride flag, usually red, that I wore as a full-time seminary teacher. And I remember after work visiting, for whatever reason at somebody's house, and they were in my ward. And, he made a comment, about the tie tack. Why are you wearing that? And tried to explain. I said, this just says I love all my students know that I'm a safe space. So,
did you ever get pushback from either colleagues or people above you for things like that?
I think that was right near the end. I don't know that was in 2020.
Yeah. Okay. Rhonda, who's listening, by the way, says, hello, friends. So glad you're having this discussion. Thanks for listening, Rhonda. I appreciate you being here. Let's spend a little bit of time before we run out of time, then moving into why you're interested into sex therapy. It's one thing to become a licensed social worker. That's in of itself a very big project. So adding an ASEX certification is another 18 months to 2 years process. You don't even get another master's degree for it. It's just a certification. So tell me a little bit about your decision process to head down that road.
It comes up with so many. Just sex, sexual shame. It just comes up every day with all my clients, and I felt that there's a gap in my training, so let's fill it.
Yeah, I would agree. When people ask me, why'd you become a sex therapist? I jokingly mimic the South Park. It's like the Mormons.
Because and I have clients that are fully active in the church, and they have come to me for various reasons. A lot of it might be that they have family members that are LGBTQ. They might, but for whatever reason, like you say often, and you probably word it better than me, but the education that people get is lacking, and I want to be able to help people live life to their fullest, including overcome shame, and a lot of that is sexual shame. Yeah,
right. Well, and I think it's important too to not treat the Mormon or Latter-day Saint population as a monolith. There's a huge spectrum, right? There's very Orthodox folks within the Mormon community. There's many more kind of middle of the road folks. There's progressive folks. I mean, I forget now the numbers, but when they've done research on this, there are many, many Latter-day Saints who are active consider themselves active and believing members who are LGBTQ affirming and supportive, and who have LGBTQ friends and family. And so this idea that all Latter-day Saints are somehow, in a space of discriminating against LGBTQ folks is just not really necessarily the case at all. And they themselves are trying, I think, to do advocacy work within the community. We've got a lot of groups like Mormons Building Bridges, Mama Dragons. There's another one that now the name escapes me, but there's several groups that are affirmation, several groups of people who are still within the church, but are recognizing that this work needs to be done and we need to be in a better space with more affirming and more understanding of human sexuality and its diversity and things of that nature. So, but yes, I'm super glad anytime a fellow colleague is moving towards ASEX certification, it just makes my heart happy. So, because I know what a difference that made in my career and my professional development to really, really dig into my biases and understand human sexuality myself in ways that I was never trained, even as a marriage and family therapist, right? So as a marriage therapist, you're a social worker. I was not really trained in human sexuality other than one quick course on basic ideas about how human beings develop, but not really with the intersection of all these complexities of beliefs and values and how do we show up and what do we believe about ourselves and how anatomy works and how do you share your sexuality with another person and ownership models and differentiation models. It's very, very complex and fascinating field of study. So welcome to the fold.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in general, I just mostly find myself helping my clients tap into their inner wisdoms. And whether that's about life in general, about dealing with anxieties, about processing life after they make big changes, whether it's religious or related to any topic, that I think that human beings, we're able to, the way I label it, I think that we all have the ability to be both beautiful and badass. And I take a very IFS, internal family systems approach to it, where maybe a part of us is functioning from a space of fear is making decisions. But if we're able to make decisions from our core and make decisions that align with our values, then we will make decisions that will be better for our mental health. We'll feel better. We will, I have values that align with the church. I have values that align with lots of different things and can come from tons of different sources. And I have values that don't align with them. And the more often we can make decisions that align with our values, the better I think our lives will be.
Yeah. No, that's really great. I love beautiful and badass. That seems like it should be like a bumper sticker or something. So
if I write a book, it'll be in the title.
That'll be the title. Okay. Do you want to say anything in regards to, I know this has been at least in my practice, both with talking to colleagues and talking with many of my clients who have shown up with a myriad of emotions, mostly tears or fear or frustration or downright rage and anger. We have dealt with an election that I think is somewhat different than many elections I've lived through in the past. And I think it held a lot of story around identity and personal rights, and in regards especially to LGBTQ folks and folks, folks of color, and also those who identify as women. In particular, these seem to be some populations that are very concerned about their well-being, their rights, how other people perceive them. And this, of course, is a much larger thing than just LDS or Mormon culture. So do you want to say anything about your experience in the last few weeks with your clientele?
It's been rough. Yeah. I think I really like what I saw, I think was Brittany Hartley the other day saying what she's done afterwards is that it does, even if I think the way she worded it, even if we don't topple kings, and even if the planet were hit by a meteor tomorrow, I'm still do this work. That was helpful for me. I'm at a loss personally, and I'm here as a professional in this interview, but personally trying to figure out how, and I think it's a fear-based response. I think people make decisions based on fear at times. And I think it's easy to make decisions to support ourselves when we're in that fear-based space. And I think it's easier. And I guess I'm trying to answer the question of why the election went the way it went. Yeah, I just continue to try to, okay, this is how it is today. What can I do today that'll be beautiful in a badass way that aligns with my values to help make the world a better place? And I get to do that, like you do with my employment and with other things in my life. But just instead of saying we are afraid, and it's easier for me to say this because of the privilege I have, right? I don't feel personally targeted but I know many of my clients do, many of my friends do. But I'm able to say, well, what can I do? How can I make a little bit of a difference in the world today? What's it been like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about it from a values perspective, which is, I think, why I have seen so many tears and anger and sadness around it, is because I think a lot of people are interpreting the choice as, oh, you are showing your values, you are showing your value. And what you value does not include me.
Yeah.
It does not include me as a minority, or me as a sexual assault victim, or me as a person of color, or me as a complicated being or trans person who has a right to medical care, and that, by the way, are like world standards, right? We're not talking about world standard healthcare. That we are, trans folks are now having to say, okay, people don't value my right to the standards of care that my situation engenders. And so I think that's where it's very personal. And some people, I think, on the other side of things may have been more fear driven, like you're saying, like, worries about inflation or worries about the cost of eggs, or, but I do think we do stand at a crossroads of values that have to do with certain privileges and rights and who has access. That is, we all have to kind of reckon with as a nation and as a people. And it's also happening globally. We're not the only country dealing with these kinds of crossroads, and what are we going to value? Yeah.
And I think it's helpful to, like, if I'm, trying to decide, if I know somebody who's voted, their vote doesn't seem to align with my values. First step is I get to decide if I want to be closer to, farther away from, or the same distance to that person in my world. Whether, it doesn't matter. Any human being on this planet, I get to make those three decisions about them. A family member, a relative, a co-congregant, a neighbor, whatever it might be. Secondly, it's going to be uncomfortable if I change the current status. If I step farther away, or if I step closer to somebody, it's going to, both of us will experience discomfort. To get closer to somebody, you're going to experience discomfort. And that's everybody. These are general principles, I think, that apply to relationships. And the third thing is is the difficult task of differentiating, to be able to spend the time processing my emotions and managing our emotions. And I'm speaking to myself, but I'm speaking to the listeners, right? To focus on taking care of yourself. I'm of the opinion that if you were to choose one person on this planet, and I ask you to choose one person on this planet and to take immaculate care of, and if you chose the right person to take immaculate care of, it would do the most overall good for the rest of the people on this planet. I'm of the opinion that if you don't choose yourself, then it won't make as good a difference. And we've been taught, and myself and most of my clients have been taught all of our lives, we need to first observe, then serve. We need to love our neighbors, love ourselves. We need to take care of other people. And this is especially as, listening to, again, Britt Hartley, or reading Celeste Davis, just the whole difference between building an ego or taking an ego down. We've been taught, we need to take care of other people. That's selfish. It's not. I don't think it is. I think it's righteous. I think it's beautiful, and I think it's badass. If you take just this much better care of yourself than you do anybody else on the planet, only this much. And it might start by just saying, all right, most people I know, most Mormon members of the church I know, whether or not, but they already have a group of people that they already take really good care of other people. It's part of their nature. It's part of their desires to take care of other people. Just include yourself in that first. Just see if you can include yourself in that group of people that you take good care of. But listen to your body, take care of your body. When you're dysregulated, check in with yourself, breathing, and do something to take care of you. If you're still distraught, or if someone's struggling with anything in life, or like we're talking about right now, the elections, do something to take care of yourself and see if you can, get to where you can make a decision instead of the parts of you that are fearful. And what decision would you like to make in the world today, in this moment? How would you like to interact?
Yep, those are all really good reminders, and it's complicated, and it's difficult. So I think we both would agree that we're just, even though there are, I think, a lot of things that we can think about, how do we take care of ourselves? It's oftentimes when I say things that are very wise, like what you're saying, I also feel this kind of like, it feels like I'm saying something simple that's very, very complicated to try to actually put into fruition when things are quite as tender as they seem to be these last few weeks. So a lot of compassion for everybody, a lot of hearts out to everybody for sure. All right, so we've come to the end of our time. I'd love to ask you, one, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you were just dying to talk about? So if there's anything like that. And then second of all, by the way, you're getting some good comments. Great stuff, Mike, and from Lisa Dame. And then Jeff Smith is like, hey, Mike, it's you. How's it going? So anyways, but is there, if people want to get a hold of you, I mean, you did talk about Flourish. I am going to put a link to Flourish as a resource in the community. But where else can people find you, or what you're doing and what you're up to as far as your own personal work?
To answer your first question, I would say my definition of compassion is to give yourself time and space to heal without judgment as much as possible, and give it to yourself first, than others. I can be found on Psychology Today, Mike Fuller. Like I said, I'm licensed. I do telehealth in the state of Utah. I'll be licensed in other states this summer. And I'm writing on Medium. So again, you can just search Mike Fuller on Medium to see some things I've written recently. Okay.
And there you're kind of like writing just about mental health issues, or just things in general, or?
Yep, just my experience, for a little bit about my experience. And I think the last article I wrote was all are welcome, and except when they're not. So
yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for spending this time with me today. I appreciate it. Thank you for the work you do within our community, and good luck with all your endeavors and, your ongoing trainings and your licensure process and all of those things. So welcome to the field, and I'm glad we had this chance to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me here. And in general, you've been very inviting into the field.
Oh, thank you. All right, Mike. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. say the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishkishe the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishkishe the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.